Imagine standing in the dust, smoke burning your eyes, gunfire tearing through your neighborhood, and then finding your wives and children dead at your feet. That was Chief Gall's reality at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. His grief turned instantly to fury, and from that moment he swore vengeance against every soldier in Custer's command. When Gall later spoke about what he witnessed, he revealed details so raw, so unfiltered, that they shook the very foundation of how Americans remembered the battle. Will you believe his version of Custer's last stand, or the one narrated by the U.S. 7th Cavalry men? Chief Gall's Eyewitness exposes the truth of Custer's last stand, a truth more gripping, more unsettling, and more human than the polished versions in textbooks. For decades, America has remembered the battle through Custer's legend, but Gall's story reveals a different picture, one of vengeance, strategy, and untold loss. But here's the question: was Custer the fearless commander who fought to the bitter end, or was his last stand a collapse of myth, reshaped by survivors and storytellers? And what did Gall actually see that the world wasn't meant to hear? Stay with me, because his account changes everything. Before we continue, take a moment to subscribe and support this channel so we can keep various voices alive and preserve the true history that textbooks often leave behind. When Lieutenant Colonel George Custer arrived at the Little Bighorn, Chief Gall and his people had only a few hours' notice. A seasoned warrior of 36, Gall had long earned his reputation in battle. He had killed American soldiers and rival enemies, gaining honor as one of the Hunkpapa Sioux's finest fighters. His worth was so great that Chief Sitting Bull adopted him as a younger brother, counting him among his closest allies and advisors. So when news of Custer's arrival reached Sitting Bull's camp, Gall was among the first to hear it. He had no way of knowing this fight would be different. It would become the defining memory of his life, retold for decades afterward. Gall was also one of the first Native Americans to share his version of the battle publicly, and what he revealed would rewrite the story of the Little Bighorn and Custer's final moments. On the morning of June 25, 1876, Sioux scouts discovered ration boxes abandoned a few miles from the village, left behind by Custer's men. The soldiers spotted the scouts and chased them off, but Custer knew they would return to report back. He believed he had no choice but to strike quickly before Sitting Bull could flee. As expected, the Sioux scouts raced back to the village with news of advancing American troops. Sitting Bull dispatched scouts to shadow the soldiers' movements while calling a council to decide their response. Sergeant Daniel Kanipe later recalled seeing these Sioux watchers on the ridges as the cavalry approached. They soon reported that the U.S. force had split, though the Sioux could not yet guess the plan. In reality, Custer had divided his men into 3 groups. With 5 companies, he moved over the bluffs to swing down on the village from the north. Major Marcus Reno took 3 companies to strike from the south. Meanwhile, Captain Frederick Benteen, with 3 more companies, maneuvered far south to cross the river and approach from the west. The American strategy was to seal off every escape route. Sitting Bull and the Sioux leaders initially agreed their best chance was to break camp and escape before the attack landed. But they underestimated the cavalry's speed. Reno's men were already fording the river and charging into the southern edge of the village. Gall later recalled that his Hunkpapa Sioux camp lay directly in Reno's path. Gunfire tore through the lodges, bullets ripping tents apart and scattering the families inside. Warriors rushed for their horses while women and children fled south, desperate to escape. Gall's first thought was of his own family. He ran to find his 2 wives and 3 children amid the chaos. But by the time he reached them, it was too late. Whether killed deliberately or caught in the crossfire, Gall's wives and children were already dead. They were killed there by the white soldiers, and it made my heart bad, he later said. In Sioux expression, to have a bad heart meant grief, despair, and vengeful rage. Gall swore revenge. "After that, I killed all my enemies with the hatchet." This was not mere imagery. To abandon the rifle for a hatchet meant a warrior had chosen brutality over survival, risking death to make his enemies suffer. For the Americans, Gall's wrath would be devastating. Meanwhile, Reno's soldiers dismounted, tying their horses in the timber and advancing on foot. They formed a skirmish line only a few hundred yards from the village and opened fire. Gall joined the defenders in resisting them. Though Sitting Bull's name remains most famous, he did not personally fight that day. By then, he had retired from combat, remaining in camp to perform medicine rituals for the warriors, prayers and ceremonies believed to bring power and victory. It was men like Gall and the Oglala Sioux leader Crazy Horse who directed the fighting. Sioux warriors countered Reno's men with gunfire and mounted charges. Reno quickly realized he was badly outnumbered. His 150 soldiers faced hundreds of defenders, with more joining by the minute. Among Reno's ranks were native scouts from the Crow and Arikara tribes, longtime enemies of the Sioux. Spotting them, the Sioux deliberately singled them out. One was Custer's chief scout and close ally, Bloody Knife. Half Arikara and half Hunkpapa Sioux, Bloody Knife had grown up alongside Gall. Their animosity ran deep. Gall mistrusted him for his Arikara blood, and their rivalry had driven Bloody Knife to leave and fight for the Americans. Over time, the feud turned bitter. Gall had already killed some of Bloody Knife's brothers and even one of his sons. As Reno's line faltered, Bloody Knife sat mounted beside him. Suddenly, a bullet struck his head, killing him instantly. Gall had no rifle, so it could not have been his shot. Still, one of the Sioux warriors must have recognized Gall's enemy and avenged him. The sight horrified Reno. Bloody Knife's blood spattered across his face. Shaken, Reno lost his nerve and ordered a retreat. Reno's men scrambled back to the timber to untie their horses and flee across the river. Gall and his warriors pounced on their panic. They dragged soldiers from their saddles, hacked them apart, or shot them in the back as they tried to escape. At least 32 soldiers fell before the survivors made it across the river to the bluffs beyond. Gall longed to pursue them, but cries from fellow warriors stopped him. Another American column was advancing from the north. If they reached the village, the women and children would be trapped. Gall turned his attention to Custer. Gall claimed that he and 3 warriors rode north along the bluffs, shadowing Custer's approach. From about 600 yards away, they watched the soldiers halt. One officer rode out ahead with binoculars, scanning the village. Custer had cut his once famous long golden hair short, so Gall did not recognize him. Only later did he realize he had been watching Long Hair himself. No one knew it was Custer, Gall later said. We could not tell him from any other. According to Gall, Custer hesitated when he saw the size of the village. He paused, perhaps realizing he had taken on more than he could handle. At that moment, Gall said, the Sioux attacked first, charging down on Custer's men as they crossed the bluffs. In Gall's telling, Custer never launched an attack. His last fight was a desperate defense. Other Sioux warriors remembered differently, insisting Custer attacked soon after Reno's retreat. Most likely, Gall arrived after Cheyenne fighters had already forced Custer back across the river, mistaking their counterattack for the opening clash. What is certain is that the fight descended into chaos. American carbines jammed from overuse, forcing soldiers to draw revolvers. Many ran out of ammunition entirely, cut down by warriors with rifles, clubs, or hatchets. Sioux fighters whipped blankets and shouted to spook the cavalry's horses, scattering mounts and trapping soldiers on foot. It was a slaughter, Gall admitted. We took no prisoners. Our hearts were bad, and we cut and shot them all to pieces. Gall believed that Custer and his men were not the very last to fall. His account held that Custer's force split. C, E, and F companies remained with Custer and his brother Tom on what became known as Custer Hill. But Gall insisted that the final resistance came from the southeast, where Lieutenant James Calhoun's L Company and Captain Miles Keogh's C Company made their stand. Step by step, Calhoun's men fell back until surrounded. They dismounted and fought on foot until the last man. Keogh and his soldiers were overwhelmed nearby, their bodies found piled together, cut down only after bitter resistance. They fought strongly, Gall later said, but it did not save them. While Custer's command was annihilated, Reno's men regrouped on the hills to the southeast. Reinforced by Benteen and the pack train around 4 p.m., they formed a defensive circle with more than 400 soldiers. Gall and Crazy Horse led repeated charges, but the cavalry held. That night, Gall ordered his warriors not to waste lives in reckless assaults. Instead, Sioux snipers harassed the soldiers while the rest rested. "They will fall into our hands when thirst burns in their throats," the leaders said. By morning, the water shortage was dire. Sioux marksmen fired at every party attempting to reach the river. Eventually, U.S. sharpshooters cleared a path, and some soldiers earned medals of honor for fetching water under fire. On June 26th, Sioux scouts spotted rising clouds of dust, General Alfred Terry and Colonel John Gibbon's column finally arriving to rendezvous with Custer. Gall called it the Big Dust and took it as the sign to leave. By sunset, Sitting Bull's people had packed up and withdrawn west toward the Big Horn Mountains. It was a resounding victory, but it would not last. The U.S. Army redoubled its campaign, and within months, most Sioux bands were forced to surrender. Gall fled with Sitting Bull to Canada, but later returned, settling at Standing Rock. He converted to Christianity and became friendly with reservation officials. In 1886, Gall was persuaded to attend the 10th anniversary commemoration of the battle. There, he met survivors of the 7th Cavalry, and for the first time, Americans heard the story of the Little Bighorn from the other side. Speaking in Lakota, English, and sign language, Gall described what he had seen, though his accounts varied across interviews. Some versions depicted him fighting Reno, while others only showed him fighting Custer. Some mentioned the deaths of his family. Others left it out. Historians debate these contradictions even today. However, despite the inconsistencies, Gall's testimony remains one of the earliest native accounts of the battle, essential for understanding not only what happened, but also how it was remembered. So what do we take from Chief Gall's story? On one side, we have the polished legend of Custer's last stand, bravery, sacrifice, and a tragic fall immortalized in textbooks and monuments. On the other hand, we have Gall's raw eyewitness truth, blood, vengeance, shattered families, and a victory that carried the weight of unbearable loss. The contrast could not be sharper, a hero's myth remembered by a nation versus a warrior's grief carried by a people. And yet, both stories speak to the same battlefield, the same dust, the same cries that echoed along the Little Bighorn. But here's the core tragedy. For Gall, victory came at the highest price imaginable, the lives of his wives and children. For Custer, defeat meant the end of his command and the shattering of his legend. Two men bound forever, not by glory, but by loss. So we are left to ask, whose truth do we honor? The version written by the U.S. 7th Cavalry, or the one spoken by a Lakota chief whose heart was made bad by grief? And here's the most unsettling question of all. If Gall's account is true, then have we been remembering Custer's last stand all wrong for nearly 150 years? History is never just one story. It is a battlefield of memory. Which side will you stand on?